Basically, my talk and reading is about how being a practicing writer, I believe, helps me to be a better teacher. And so I'll let you read most of this article yourselves, but I think that that the article touches upon some important points that maybe we can discuss after I present. But I really like, I underlined some things that I wanted to take note of at this point. When teachers write, we provide a positive model for our students. Our example says we value writing and find it useful, more so than when we sit and correct papers while the students write. I've never been one to write with my students in the classroom. I know some people that do and have, really wonderful things. I also have a friend who does his own assignments. He teaches at the University of New Hampshire. I don't know how he has the time, but he really learns how to revise his own assignments based on doing the writing that he has his students do. Yeah, so when teachers write, we give ourselves a chance to test our own writing assignments. And I sort of did that in the piece that I'm going to read to you today. I had never written a second person piece in my life, and I always sort of thought that they were usually pretty gimmicky. There's some people that do them really well, and so I just kind of tested that out. Yeah, it felt kind of uncomfortable at first, but it's kind of good. I think I can bring those struggles to the classroom, the struggles that I have with my own writing. And I know so many of you relate. When we write, when teachers write, we learn empathy for our students. Writing can be a struggle, and this fact is easy to forget if we don't wrestle regularly with it ourselves. And I think that's so true. Like when students say, I'm having such a hard time with this, and they can tell if you're being honest if you say, I know. And I remember I had a teacher as an undergraduate, and I said to her, does writing ever get easier? And she said, no, but your writing will get better. And so, and I think it's true. And so I think just being able to offer that to our students can really help them. And I'm not somebody, I've never brought my writing into the class or read anything to my students. I know lots of people do, and my hat's off to them. I don't know, I feel like I sort of like to keep a little bit of a distance, but I do talk to them a lot about, yeah, I'm working on this essay, and I just had to scrap like 90% of it, or yeah, that's a wonderful paragraph, but it might be a different essay. And I talk about people I know who, had grants and ended up, having this scrap the majority of what they did in that 6-month period, but had that sort of gem paragraph. And so revision is really big in all of our courses, and I think just, having writing as a practice can really, if you're doing it yourself, it really helps your students kind of connect with you. So, yeah, when teachers write, we become partners in a community of writers. I think that's very true too. And then, yeah, this one was interesting. During this past summer's Oregon writing project session, I discovered another reason for writing with my students. Perhaps the best one yet, from the administrator's perspective, because it directly addresses our skills as writing teachers. Here it is, writing makes us experts on teaching writing. So, I'll leave the rest of the article for you to read yourselves, but I just think it's just so clear. And I don't know, anybody have any questions before I launch into my adventure and senior instructor leave with my own creative nonfiction and the struggles I had and the piece that I wrote? Anybody questions about?
I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I had a class when I was a freshman. I was actually a sophomore with Stephen Greenblatt, and he said, he came in really kind of bummed me. It was the end of the lecture. He said, I'm sorry I'm off, but I've been working on an essay, and I struggle with writing.
Yeah.
And it was like, Stevie Greenblatt. Yeah. I laughed. And he was honest. He was struggling with writing. And I realized right there, okay, writing's not something you're born into. I used to believe that. You're a born writer, right?
Yeah.
And so I wasn't a born writer, right? And so I realized, okay, it's a craft. It's something that you actually, it's technical, right?
Yeah.
And it's something you learn, and that helped. That's why I'm here, actually.
Yeah, it does demystify it, I think.
Yeah.
Because there is this weird, mystique. I talk to my visual arts students, do you call yourself an artist? And a lot of them do. But there are very few undergraduates, I think, that would call themselves writers. So yeah, I think showing them that it's a practice, like you were saying, is helpful. So there's my little practice. Go ahead, Rob.
Just one thought. I mean, apart from the individual impact on an individual student, I think the notion, I think we gain a lot when we frame the entire classroom as a community. And instead of, one of the things I mentioned the very first day is that I don't see the people in the room as students taking a writing course. I see them as writers forming a community of writers who can, trade strategies. And that shift in mindset, to see yourself as a writer, is probably the most fundamental thing we can accomplish in any writing course.
Yeah, I really agree, because it helps them see each piece as malleable. And most of them are used to just getting something back with a grade on it and not revising. And so
the individual impact is certainly there, but I think as a collective, the kind of classroom ethos, having that shift for them to see themselves as writers, huge.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah. And yeah, revision's a big one that's hard to teach. And this piece I sent out to the Gettysburg Review, and the editor wrote back and said, I'm almost willing to take this as is, but there's this whole other dimension that I think it would raise the essay to a whole other level if you could really explore this one dimension. Would you consider it? And I was like, oh no, I don't want to explore that dimension. So, but I took a little time and I sat down and did, and I was glad that I did. So again, it's hard to get feedback on your own work that you don't want to do, and so I can tell my students that. And also show them the same editor years ago sent a piece back to me that had all kinds of awful, and I can't find it. I wish that I still had it, but I used to bring it into my students. There would be paragraphs that he would just write, so what, and underline, or just he also wrote big deal, and he was offering to take the piece if I was willing to do certain revisions. I ended up not doing the revisions because I think the piece would have been, the whole message of the piece wasn't something that I really believed in at the time, and I thought, oh, is this really dumb? But I just think it's important to show my students that, yeah, I got a thing with X is a big deal, and, all that sort of stuff. And yeah, most of the time it's just a slip of paper that, has nothing written on it. So that's even a good rejection. That's the right big deal. So, I don't know. So this piece is called Body Worlds, and please let me know if I need to slow down or anything. I realized when I was reading it, it's second person, which is a little weird to be reading, so I don't know. All right, so here we go. You met a guy online. You've had 4 or 5 dates, and you haven't so much as held hands. He is artistic. His expensive button-down shirts are decorated with bold, colorful patterns. He has 2 tickets to the Body Worlds exhibition in Denver, a traveling display of human bodies and body parts that have been preserved using a process called plastination. His firm designed the banners. Yes, you say, you would like to go. The link he sends you says, the presentation of the pure physical reminds visitors to Body Worlds of the intangible and the unfathomable. A little more than a year ago, your father died alone in a hospital in Ireland. You held his hand in the morgue at Mayo General Hospital. It was yellow and had a large sore above the knuckles. On top of his, your hand looked red. You were aware of your own blood pumping. Plastination is the process by which a scientist removes all bodily fluids and replaces them with reactive resins and polymers. Blood, saliva, mucus, tears, pus, earwax, lymph. You're probably glad that you already ate. The nurses told you your father was septic. For years his intestines had been leaking because he couldn't stop drinking. He had destroyed couches and mattresses on Long Island, Manhattan, and an island off the west coast of Ireland, where he had moved alone 6 months before. You wait for your date in the lobby of the Denver Museum of Science and Nature. You have a cold, and you worry that your breath is bad. You duck into the cafeteria, hoping a bottle of water might help. When you come back to the lobby, there he is, wearing a crisp white button-down splashed with primary colors. You hug lightly and quickly and walk toward a crowded escalator that leads to the exhibit. At the entrance, a poster board explains that the process of plastination gives the specimens rigidity and permanence. You wonder, how long does something have to exist in order to qualify as permanent? The poster board says you may not touch the plastinates, and cameras are not permitted at the exhibit. You wonder if flashes would damage the bodies. Would sunlight, ocean waves, the touch of a hand? It rained into your father's open grave, at least a foot of water. Ireland in December. The gray-haired pallbearers strained and slid in the mud. You thought they might hurt themselves. Before they began to lower him, the men looked your way, seeming unsure. Maybe they thought it would upset you to see your father's coffin submerged in water. But you realize you may be projecting. The manager of the cottage your father had been renting had told you stories of brides wearing wellies on Ackle Island. This was probably not the first time these men had buried someone in water on land. The exhibit is crowded, and you wait with 100 other people behind a red velvet rope. The visitors ahead of you must be taking their time. You fidget and look at the program. The plastinated post-mortal body illumines the soul by its very absence. Do you want us to call a priest? The ICU nurse asked your father when he was admitted to the hospital. Don't bother, he evidently said. The nurses giggled when they told you the story. They handed you a plastic bag filled with the clothes your father had worn to the hospital. Khaki pants, blue-clad pajama top, gray tweed jacket. A stubborn old coot is perhaps how they wanted to see this 63-year-old white-bearded American, and perhaps that is one way to look at him. But you can't help but picture your father 20 years before, hands covering his face in church, praying for what? To be a better husband and father? Don't bother. You wonder if he was trying to be funny. You wonder if he believed in God. You worry that he thought he was beyond redemption. A museum employee unclips the red velvet rope, and you and your date walk into a room with hard, brightly lit cadavers. Most are in active and provocative poses. A runner mid-stride. A ballerina in a pirouette, naked but for one pink slipper. One body is a human mobile sliced lengthwise into dozens of amber pieces, dangling side by side from clear strands of fishing line. If the wind blew, the slivers would clang together like chimes. You and your date walk from body to body, rarely looking at each other. You move away as kids swerve through openings in the crowd, calling to their siblings, "Look, the nervous system!" A boy shrieks and points to a tree-like network of nerves that has been removed from a cadaver, shot through with red plastic, and placed between two glass panels. You were around this boy's age when you asked your mother to define the word alcoholic. You had heard the term applied not only to your father, but to 3 of your grandparents. Your mother told you an alcoholic is a very sensitive person. At the time, you thought this was a ridiculous explanation, right up there with your mother's story that her mother had died of fear. Now, you wonder, how much does sensitivity have to do with genetics and the mechanics of the nervous system? Would a trained eye looking at this red-dyed neural network be able to tell if this person is depressed, alcoholic, likely to die of fear? Weeks before the Body Worlds exhibition, you and your date went for a hike in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. The trail became narrow, a sheer cliff on one side, a nearly vertical rock face on the other. A coiled rattlesnake sat on an eye-level ledge. You both froze and looked at it. Your date asked if you would stand between him and the snake so he would feel safe passing. You were surprised that he asked, but you did it anyway. When you were 10, your father would announce, "It's time for toughness drills." You and your siblings would stand in a line facing him on the lawn. As hard and as fast as he could, your father would kick and throw soccer balls at your torsos, faces, and shins. Your job was to run toward them and not flinch. Your job was to override your survival instincts. You soon learned that the harder you ran toward the balls, the less they hurt. A basketball player mid-pivot, a soccer player about to strike. The plastinated bodies are the color of Utah mud. You think of creation myths, Genesis, the Quran, Prometheus sculpting people out of clay. There is an ice skater just before a spin. Boots, blades, bones. You think of chicken, the wishbones your mother hung from the handles of the kitchen cabinets or left on the windowsills to dry. How your father said to hold your hand still and let the other person pull. A head is a room filled with healthy and diseased organs. Along the wall, a woman in a wheelchair is crying. A man rubs her back. You have lost your date and you look for him in the crowd. He stands in front of a case filled with stomachs and pieces of stomachs. That is what an ulcer looks like. You think of walking up to him and taking his hand. You want him to know that your mother had an ulcer, that her lungs were speckled with green-black tar, that like her mother, she died, perhaps of fear, when she was 54. The next case contains a human heart. The nurses said your father's was infected. It probably did not look like the remarkably red, remarkably heart-shaped muscle beneath the glass. You and your date stand looking down at it. You grip the side of the case. You don't reach for his hand because you are afraid he might not want to hold yours. 4 years before, you went to see your father in a hospital on Long Island. He had had a heart attack. You stood in the doorway and he glared at you from the hospital bed. A year before that, you told him you thought he was an alcoholic. He grabbed a candlestick from the table and shook it in your face. My father drank more than I do, and he was no alcoholic. At the hospital, you walked to the side of his bed, leaned over, and kissed his cheek. Your father stared at the ceiling and pretended you weren't there. Days later, you spoke to a nurse on the phone. She said your father was shaking and hallucinating from alcohol withdrawal. "These are not the DTs," he had bellowed at the doctor. "I'm recovering from a heart attack, for God's sakes." You looked toward the corner of the exhibit, a Tai Chi master with a prosthetic hip. Your father had been a successful lawyer. When you were 11, he pulled a knee bone from his briefcase, then gave you and your siblings an anatomy lesson. You remember your father sitting at the wooden kitchen table, holding the knee in the air, straightening it, then bending, then straightening it again. You know he was good at convincing juries. You watched as he put the knee back in his leather case. If you recognize the body, leave the room immediately. That is what they said to your friend before she conducted her first autopsy in medical school. You think of the Tolland man, alive in the 4th century BC. In 1950, Danish farmers found him in a peat bog. There was a noose around his neck. The farmers thought he was a recent murder victim from their town. Bristles of stubble protruded from his chin. Later, scientists discovered hallucinogens in his stomach. Maybe they were part of a sacrifice. Maybe the man was an addict. If you recognize the body, leave the room immediately. You are having trouble breathing, but it does not occur to you to leave the room. The mortician at Mayo General Hospital said he talked to your father's body while he was waiting for you to arrive from Colorado. He had put soft, immaculate cotton socks on your father's feet. You were touched by his tender attempt to make a dead man more comfortable. Soon, you learned your father's cottage was a short walk from the Applehead pub. The pub owner told you that even in November, your father would wander across the cold, rocky parking lot without any shoes. His feet must have been ravaged. You realize the mortician may have covered them to spare you. A nearby plastinate draws a bow and arrow. His biceps are large and hard and remind you of beef jerky. Alcoholics are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves, the Big Blue Alcoholics Anonymous book says. When your sister was 13, she beat your father in an arm wrestle. She was strong from shoveling horse manure and lifting bales of hay. He proclaimed she had won because he had had an arrow shot through his arm when he was her age. The arrowhead on one side, he said, demonstrating with his hand, and the feather on the other. You did not believe him because there was no scar, and your granduncle, who had been your father's pediatrician, had no recollection that this had ever happened. "I think I would remember if my nephew had an arrow shot through his arm," he said. You walk toward a case filled with livers. Your date has vanished into the crowd. A healthy liver is large and smooth and reminds you of a stingray. The alcoholic's is a dry chunk of coral. You look up and see that someone has sneaked in a camera. He quickly snaps a picture of a plastinate hunched over a chessboard. The plastinate's brain floats between two pieces of skull. It reminds you of a cauliflower or a mushroom cloud. Your brothers and sisters did not go to Ireland when your father died. Before you left, your older sister asked you to take a picture of your father in the coffin. She thought it might give her closure. When you handed her the photo, she looked at it for a long time. Then she lifted her head and asked, "Are you sure that's Dad?" A year before, he had been blonde and clean-shaven. In the picture, he had a long white beard. The tension in his face is gone. You stare at the grooves of the chess-playing brain. You think of what a therapist told you about neural pathways, how they become worn with the habits we develop, being afraid, acting tough when you are afraid, choosing moody, distant men over those who are steady and kind. Changing a habit is like trudging through waist-deep snow, she said. The brain's response is, why do that when I have already shoveled a path? Since your father died, you have dated numerous men. A businessman folk artist who hardly said a word. A lawyer with a mood-altering pedantry. Picture a very loving person standing with you at your father's grave, your therapist suggested, when you told her you could not bear this story alone. But you are bearing this story alone. You are filled with grief, and you don't yet have the faith or strength to trudge through waist-deep snow. Gunther von Hagens, a German scientist, is the inventor of plastination and the founder of Body Worlds. There are pictures of him throughout the exhibit. In every one, he wears an Indiana Jones-style hat. His face is thin and rubbery. He reminds you of a clown who has just taken off his makeup. Von Hagen's best friend died of kidney failure. He plastinated the man shortly after. In an interview, von Hagen said, quote, "It was like he stretched his hand across the barrier of death, and I got at peace with him." Von Hagen says it is difficult to place a specimen in a desired pose. You wonder whose desire he is fulfilling. Was the ballerina even a dancer in real life? Would she have minded being a dancer for all foreseeable eternity? You wonder how von Hagens would have posed your father. As a child, winding up to kick the door when his father left for World War II, fist clenched, standing before you, your siblings, your mother, mid-stride, demonstrating how not to run like a girl. Like the ice skater, would von Hagens have given your father a prop? Would he let him wear his tweed Irish bucket hat, the one that used to embarrass you, the one he wore when he stood on the sidelines watching you and your siblings play soccer? Would there be an arrow sticking out of his arm? Would he sit your father in a wingback chair, glass of scotch in one hand? And what if your father had a say? He could ask the scientist to pose him in a way that reflected not how his life turned out, but how he wanted it to be. Seated at the table of his immigrant grandparents, a holy grail of singing and recitations and Sunday roasts. Maybe von Hagens would have posed him at a lectern, a history professor instead of a lawyer. That's what I really wanted to be, your father always said, but your grandfather was a lawyer, and history professors don't make enough money. Would more than one of his 7 children and stepchildren be at his graveside? Your father worked really hard to alienate himself from everyone, the friend said after he died. Maybe he wanted to die alone. But it is hard for you to bear the thought of anyone wanting to die alone. You are nearing the end of the exhibit. The crowd moves, and you catch a glimpse of the colorful splashes on your date's shirt. He has stopped before a plastinate who is holding his skin as if it were a robe or a towel. You stare at the folds in the plastinate's hand. You think of the terry cloth bathrobe your father wore for the years he was hungover and lying on the couch, his intestines leaking. You scan the room filled with plastinates. They stand like mannequins and dangle from the ceiling like marionettes. A rearing horse, a man with a torch. You want to run through the exhibit, pushing them over and slashing the fishing lines that hold them in midair. You want to hear them shatter as they hit the ground. Instead, you stand there motionless. You, your date, and this strange skinless man. Any questions? I wasn't worried reading this one at a luncheon, but yeah.
Yeah, why the second person?
I think because it was such a hard topic, it helped me to view myself as a character more. It helped me to have that distance, you know. And I wanted to just sort of, I don't know, I just maybe give myself different writing exercises sometimes, and so that was part of it.
So it's sort of like a mask, you know, WHO audience theory of the mask that actually frees you to say things that you wouldn't be able to say otherwise.
Pros and cons of plasticine.
I think it's something we matches
Right.
into, though.
Right.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It matches perfectly to the plastic.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what they want.
I love the way the final image is sort of a metaphor for trying to free your father.
Mm-hmm.
Nice of your father.
Yeah.
It's,
The narrator's father, right? Yeah, my father. about it,
Right,
yeah.
there you go.
Right, yeah, yeah. But,
How long did it take to write the piece? I mean, was it one that you did consistently or just?
well, I started kind of writing in the journal about it a few years ago, and then I put it away for a couple of years and then went back to it, like over the senior instructor leave. So I would say the bulk of the writing happened like last year. Yeah.
But you've been thinking.
Yeah, I thought that exhibit was just so bizarre and it made me really angry at the time. Like I could write another like feminist piece about that art of that exhibit. I don't know if you went there, but the Body Worlds thing, but yeah, there's a lot more to be said about Body Worlds for sure that didn't really belong in the piece. But yeah, so that's kind of I don't know, what I bring to the classroom, just working on stuff like this. So. Not everything is as dark. I was a little bummed that I couldn't read. Actually, most of it's dark, but a lot of it has more dark humor. This piece didn't have a lot of dark humor. So, but
Kerry, you don't have to, I'm sorry to dominate asking all the questions. You don't have to answer this, but how did writing that alter your relationship with your father?
I think it made things a little bit more clear. I think I have like run the gamut of emotions for sure, and I think that I had compassion and anger, and I think some of that's in the piece. So I think it just made me a little bit more clear on some things. But then you just I don't know. Writing always makes things way more simple than they are. But yeah, I would say I look at them with maybe compassion when I read the piece. So I don't know.
Kerry, can you talk about putting the exhibit in with the date, putting those two things together and how you came to that and maybe why you did that?
Well, it was interesting because the editor wanted more about the date. And so I put the stuff, I hate writing about, I've always hated writing about romantic relationships. I just find it so hard. But, so that was actually another challenge too.
But one of the juxtaposition between the love of the father and the love of the mother, right? That's what he was trying to play with.
Yeah, and I think he wanted something really different than what I came up with, but he was okay with it. Like the fear stuff became more like pronounced because of that weirdo thing that happened with the rattlesnake and so.
Yeah.
I mean, it is important. I mean, it's an important question too, because I think a lot of people think sometimes, well, specifically creative nonfiction, that they're always conceptual and idea driven, right? You know what I'm saying? It's always about rhetoric, right? You know, okay, juxtaposing this relationship with this relationship, and the questions that Don's asking is kind of the heart of like how you're trying to conceive and craft a piece. So it's not necessarily, I would argue poetry is the same way, but not actually all things. But really creative nonfiction, where you're really trying to kind of create representational arguments without being explicit.
Yeah.
Right?
I always start like with no clue though. I always start sort of an intuitive thing about, but I know that some people.
Let's not tell our students.
I know. Actually, I do. I just tell them like make a mess, and see if there's anything in the mess. But it can take forever though. Yeah. Go ahead.
Along those lines, from your writing, before this, but of course you had this opportunity to have this kind of concentrated time with your writing that you probably haven't had in a while, maybe over the summertime. But what do you bring to the classroom specifically in terms of writing prompts or writing exercises, and then specific things that you do, like you were just suggesting, help them recognize in terms of writing process, or lead them through, or suggest to them in terms of writing process? And so, sort of from the exercises, the prompts where you get to something that has a central nerve to it, and then the whole nurturing of it, or following it, or whatever. What do you bring to the classroom?
Every day we do a 10-minute free write, like I think a lot of people do, but and it's almost like, just explain it, this is like your push-ups or your playing the scales if you play the piano, or it's just what you do, a 10-minute free write. And so, they can be sometimes political topics, sometimes, like what's in the basement, or, something just, what that gets them, and then I have them just underline.
So you do a prompt?
Yeah, a prompt every day, a different prompt. And then I just always have everybody underline at least one section, and then we go around the room, everyone without commentary in between reads just the one line, so that we can all kind of, but some people end up writing essays based on, even just an argumentative essay, like based on just that one line or something that really fired them up.
But following up on Paul's question, I mean, as you're reading, I kept thinking of how I would teach your story, because I mean, the way it moves in and out of time, and the binaries, and the themes and everything. So do you have, like, prompts on binaries or prompts for time, or, I mean?
I don't really, I don't know. It's interesting because some people think in a very linear way, and I'm jealous of that sometimes, but I think, yeah, I don't. Sometimes I've had them read the Robert Root article on collage and montage essays in the 2020 class. I don't know if you've used that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, I feel like.
You do have them do prompts on time. I was in your class once, and it's really, really useful. How to stretch out.
Oh, their time
seconds.
expansion. Yeah, yeah.
And how to squeeze down years in a couple of phrases.
Yeah.
She has them, they're very effective.
Yeah, we read Tobias Wolff's story, Bullet in the Brain. There's a great New Yorker podcast, so it goes over really well in the class, and you can beam it up and show them that he takes 3 paragraphs for something that was like a second, and then he takes 3 paragraphs for something for maybe like 4 or 5 decades. So just sort of telling them it's okay to take up more space at a time. Then To the Lighthouse, I always bring up that too, like 160 pages is chapter 1, and that's, you know, an afternoon thing, and then 20 years, 20 pages, and then the last chapter is 100 pages for a morning, you know, so. Yeah, I guess I do talk about time. Thanks.
Well, I think what's interesting about it too is that, about your story, that I think that students can have fun following. They're so used to imposing structure onto something, and you were talking about how your mind isn't linear, but you were writing the way that the mind does work, which is this associating. You know, in this particular exhibit, that you kept connecting your father to it, but it was a triangulation because there's also this other man, this stranger, a strange stranger in the mix, and that's the way the mind tends to work. You were in that particular present of the exhibit. There was the reminder of your father that was very immediate, at the same time that you were kind of noticing this rattlesnake weirdo and.
It's not Brian.
And ooh, can I have his number? But I think that was what would, of course you had to make it less messy than the way that the mind actually works. But I think free writing for students, if they can let it just be what the mind is doing next and how those connections are happening, and then you can sometimes actually find your mind doing something almost as neat, as crafted as what you did in the story, where there's this relationship among 2 or 3 or 4 things that are playing with each other in your mind at the same time. And so I think following the way that the mind really works can be really interesting for a writer, but for students as well.
But it's also that argumentation is not linear either.
Exactly.
Right? It's not something, you know, you come
right.
in fact, it never is. I mean, argue with anyone, you'll know that, right?
Yeah,
there's never a linear argument to it. The other thing, I actually saw your paper as a research paper, actually. You know, that it was, you know, and it's how you get students to think about and own public knowledge. Right, becomes a really hard thing that, you know, somehow research papers and facts aren't just there, right? That you inevitably, you walk into facts, you walk into an archive, you walk into knowledge constantly through a filter of the subject, right? And they're emotional, right? They're emotive. They do lots of things. So I think that and you can teach students that, right? On the one hand, you can make your assignment, I feel, 3 different assignments, like a standard BodyWorks research paper, right? And then, you know, and then kind of go into explain, okay, how can we meld these different styles together? Because that's what creative nonfiction is, interestingly, is melding different styles together, the expositive and so forth. And in some ways, to teach them different types of writing, you have to break it up into these different things, and then they kind of come together. And then those pieces become part of the portfolio. But yeah, yeah, so that, I obviously have to wrap up, but I just wanted to, one thing I really liked about this particular black bag is you're seeing, you know, two really important people in our program coming together doing really important work. It seems very different, but is actually incredibly important for who we are. And thank you so much for doing it.
Thank you.